Chapter 4. Charles pressed both hands against the great wooden door, pushed it forward, and then beckoned for me to follow him into the royal banquet hall. I took a deep breath and then stepped through the door, though I was a little disappointed when I first walked in. The back entrance made me feel like we were sneaking inside, and instead of a trumpet fanfare, I was welcomed by the sound of people eating and chatting. It was not the grand entrance I thought a royal banquet deserved. "Damn, it's hot in here," I muttered as the heat in the room hit me, which was also not what I expected from my first royal banquet. The room was about the length of a football field, but it was packed with bodies and lit by torches that, combined with the stone walls, had turned the vaulted space into a heat trap. If I'd been in one of my other forms, I'm sure I would have started panting. "It's quite nice in the winter," the physician replied. I nodded, but I was already looking around at the rest of the hall. Large tables, maybe 50 feet long, stood in neat rows around the room. A blue, white, and yellow ribbon ran along the center of each table, and each ribbon featured a shining silver crescent moon. The ribbons were carefully placed so that each moon was in the middle of the table, and I noticed that no one dared to set anything on it. A smaller version of the flag I'd seen flying from the battlements hung over the room, and I noticed the same silver threads like the ones in the ribbons. There was a starry night feel to it, which made sense if you worshipped the moon goddess. The whole scene was like something out of a movie. I had never seen so many people dressed in old-fashioned clothing in one place in my life, and thought that this is what it must feel like to be on a film set. But it wasn't a film set. This was just what Lupercalia was like. Most of the women were wearing blue, yellow, or red dresses that were long and cinched in at the waist with a black rope tassel. Some of them were wearing crazy headdresses that looked like miniature fabric cathedrals on top of their heads. I couldn't understand how they were able to keep their heads up, but they not only managed that, they were also chowing down just as heartily as the men. "This way," Charles growled, and we walked past a few of the tables. I realized that I'd started to garner some attention from the other people in the room. A table of women looked over at me and then back at each other and giggled, while some of the men we passed studied me the way a guard dog watches a stranger. I felt like I was back in high school. In fact, when I think about it, there wasn't much difference between the royal banquet hall and a plain old high school cafeteria. Both shared a love of long tables, clear cliques, and dislike of the new guy. But thoughts of high school were quickly vanquished when I got a good look at the night's feast. Each table had its own suckling pigs, massive bowls of fresh fruit, and loaves of bread that were as large as pigs. The scent was heavenly, and I was reminded that I hadn't eaten in, well, hours maybe. I looked up just in time to avoid plowing into the back of my guide, and what I saw then nearly froze me in place. 6 very large wolf hybrids were standing on a dais and watching the people below. The hybrids were about 9 feet tall, and they all wore long-sleeved chainmail shirts with hoods. On top of that, they wore a breastplate that had been etched with what I assumed was some sort of coat of arms. The armor shone brightly, even in the dim light of the banquet hall, and the closest thing I could compare it to was freshly polished silver. Behind them was a massive tapestry that covered the back wall. It must have taken years to create, but I recognized the woman in the center of the piece. There she was, just as I'd seen her back in that burning house on Sagamore, with a long blue dress, long silver hair, and shocking pale skin. "Whoa!" I trailed off. "Indeed," Charles agreed. "So you're knights?" I asked the closest wolfman because I couldn't think of anything else to ask. The wolf hybrids ignored me, and Charles shook his head at my ignorance. Sighed and decided I would just wait for someone to tell me what to do next. While I waited, I studied the 6 armed men on the dais. As I looked more closely, I saw that most of the coats of arms were some variation of the moon cycle, and the chest plates were studded with jewels like sapphires and rubies that represented stars and the sun. The weapons were just as impressive, like the sword of the wolfman to my left. The weapon must have been about 5 feet tall and featured a handle carved to look like a crescent moon and a blade studded with opals and rubies. I glanced at the wolfman on my right and saw he held another carved sword. The handle on his was shaped like a woman, and I decided it was supposed to be the moon goddess. It was actually a pretty good representation if the woman who'd given me the ring was their goddess. "Oh my!" I heard the doctor mumble behind me. I glanced back at the man and noticed that he was cowering in the face of these decorated knights. I didn't really blame him. I mean, the swords alone were probably as tall as his entire body. However, the large wooden throne that they all vaguely orbited around was empty. Where is the king? Charles asked the knight with the moon goddess sword. He is attending to a group of witches, the wolf knight responded in a low growl. They have not found sufficient milkweed in the forest to make their poisonous brew for the moat. The wolfman's eyes never left the banquet hall behind us, and I wondered if these guys were supposed to be like the soldiers at Buckingham Palace or if they really didn't trust the people eating at the tables. Well, when will he return? The doctor asked. The wolf ignored him, and the wolf's eyes passed over the physician and settled on the remains of one of the pigs like the poor man didn't even exist. When is he expected to return? Charles repeated, this time a bit louder. He is expected to return at any moment, the wolf replied in a bored voice. One of his squires is taking his direwolf to the stables as we speak. Excellent. Charles rubbed his hands together. I trust this is a matter of great urgency? The knight looked me up and down, and I could see that he was perplexed by my clothing. He wrinkled his brow, and his eyes widened slightly as he looked at my Hulk t-shirt. A great mystery, in fact. Oh, the knight responded. And who have you brought? He is a shifter, Charles replied to the knight. But he is new to Lupercalia. Well, a shifter who is not of Lupercalia. It's simply unheard of. The knight tried to sound bored, but his eyes had narrowed and his gaze was locked on me. That's what I've been hearing all day, I responded to the knight. Yet here I am. He can't really be one of the gifted, the knight growled. The moon goddess would not choose someone like him. He says he doesn't even know about the goddess, Charles replied. Blasphemy, the knight said in shock. I might have met her, I offered. That didn't improve the situation, and now Charles the guard and the physician were all staring at me like I'd grown another head. But I'd be happy to learn about the moon goddess, I added. All that you need to know of our most esteemed moon goddess can be found behind the dais. It was enormous, about 50 feet by 70 feet, and it was surprisingly well detailed for such an archaic art form. The colors were bold enough to have just come out of the dyeing vats, and I wondered if some sort of the weaving skills of the people who had created it. So I studied the images and tried to make sense of whatever story the piece told. In the center was a large green field and a village that reminded me of stock around, though I wasn't quite sure what that story was. On the left-hand side of the tapestry it was night, and on the right side it was day. In the night portion of the tapestry, the fields were run rampant with evil-looking beasts that had faces in the middle of their stomachs and multiple legs. The evil creatures were taking over the houses, lighting them on fire, and dragging people out. One of the creatures with a face on its stomach could hear the baby scream. As I looked more closely, I noticed that some of the eyes of the creatures had been embedded with rubies for dramatic effect, which made them look especially evil. The moon goddess was positioned between night and day, and she was handing a silver sword to a wolf knight that was kneeling at her feet. With one hand she gave him the sword, and the other one was pointing forward to the daytime segment of the tapestry. The day portion of the tapestry showed the villages as calm and thriving, with like one of those romantic images of rustic life, the kind that never showed how miserable things really were. And honestly, I hadn't been in stock long enough to know if the people there were actually happy, or if they were just as miserable as peasants everywhere. At the top of the tapestry in the sky was the moon cycle with a full moon in the center, just above the goddess herself. Plenty of silver thread had gone into that portion of the tapestry, and even in my world I knew it would cost a lot of money. Incredible, isn't it? Charles remarked. It is, I agreed. I've never seen anything like it. But what's happening on the left side? The moon goddess imbued us with our shifting powers in order to protect the kingdom from the foul beasts that threatened to destroy it, he explained. But everything's peaceful now? I asked. Charles didn't respond, and the physician cleared his throat. It might be a bit of an exaggeration, the doctor sighed when I looked at him. Things are not as peaceful as we would hope for them to be, and our duty never ceases. It may not be perfect, but it is much more peaceful than it was, Charles. Of course, the physician quickly agreed. Before I could ask another question, trumpets sounded from somewhere, and a moment later the door to the banquet hall swung open. Everyone was on their feet by then, and every eye was turned toward the entryway. All hail the king of Lupercalia, eternal protector in the most high of the kingdom of Lupercalia. The crowd recited the line over and over, and I had to admit it was pretty damn impressive. The kingdom may not have been perfectly peaceful, but it certainly looked successful. The banquet was amazing, the weapons and armor were kick-ass, and the knights were clearly the favorites of the crowd. Maybe I could have little fun on my vacation after all. 2 weeks of being feted and celebrated might be just what my sister had ordered, and at the end I could go home and tell her that I'd had a great time. I was so caught up in my fantasy that I nearly missed the king's arrival, and after everything I'd seen so far, it was disappointing. He was about 6 feet tall and quite fat. He was in human form and had thin, gray hair that peeked out from beneath a floppy blue hat, and a gray beard that needed a good trim. At least his tunic looked expensive, from the royal blue color of the velvet to the jewels and pearls that formed a scene of the. On top of this, he also wore a large silver amulet in the shape of a crescent moon, which rested in the middle of his round belly. "Kneel down," Charles whispered from below me, and I realized that everyone in the hall had already sunk to their knees. I followed suit and lowered myself to one knee like a football player on the sideline, but everyone else kept their eyes on the floor, so the only thing I saw when the king walked by was a pair of sturdy leather boots over blue cotton leggings. When the king and his party had passed by, I risked a quick peek and watched as he clambered onto a relatively nondescript wooden throne. I'd actually thought it was just an ordinary chair, but the velvet cushion and the position of the chair directly underneath the moon goddess on the tapestry probably should have tipped me off. "All right," the king announced in a friendly old voice. "What news have you on this day?" It was so silent that you could hear a pin drop. "Sire," one of the wolf knights finally replied, "Sir Charles of Stock has come with urgent news from the countryside, and brings a visitor." "A visitor?" The king laughed, and I heard a banging noise as he swung his legs against the wooden throne in excitement. "It's been some time since we've had a visitor. Has he traveled far?" "I do not know, sire," the wolf knight said. "Well, bring forward Charles and his visitor, and we can attend to this most urgent matter," the king said. Suddenly the court began to murmur. Charles stood up and tapped on my shoulder. I took that as a sign that I should stand as well, so I quickly dusted off my clothes and then turned to face the king of Lupercalia. Charles cleared his throat, shook his head again, and then changed into his hybrid form. He gave me a warning glance to stay put, and then he took a step closer to the dais. "Charles," the king greeted him and cleared his throat gruffly. "Who have you brought for me?" "A visitor," Charles said. "Will you meet with him? He has a most peculiar story." "Ah," the king said. "You know I can't resist a good story. Very well, let's meet this visitor." Charles beckoned at me to come over, and I took a couple of steps forward to stand next to the knight. "This is Hank of... Charles hesitated as he tried to remember where I'd said I was from. "New Jersey," the doctor called out from behind me in a small voice before I could fill in the blank myself. "Hank of New Jersey," the king repeated slowly. "And do you have a family name?" "My full name is Henry John Baker, Your Highness," I replied as I waited for the inevitable question about my family's occupation. Charles looked back at me and then back at the king. "But you can call me Hank," I added. "Henry the Baker of New Jersey," the king cheered and opened his arms. "Welcome to Lupercalia." I heard some confused murmurs from the crowd, but no one seemed very impressed with the introduction, even though it was delivered by the king. "No, I'm not actually a baker," I started. He is a shifter," Charles announced gruffly, and the entire banquet hall went quiet again. "A shifter?" The king brought his fist to his chin and squinted. "A commoner?" Charles and the doctor both looked at me expectantly. What were they waiting for? "Go on," the doctor hissed. Charles looked at me imploringly. "Shift," the doctor hissed again. I felt kind of shit-shy about the whole thing. I wasn't really convinced I could actually do it on command, but as I looked at the glittering armor and the giant gemstones, I knew I wanted in on the action, even if it was just for 2 weeks. So I closed my eyes and imagined the feeling of growing. I felt an electric energy start to course through my limbs, followed by the weird sensation of being stretched in every direction. When I opened my eyes, I was covered in brown fur, my nose had lengthened, and I was definitely a lot taller. There were gasps from the hall, But the king looked unconvinced. He was definitely suspicious, though I don't know how you could fake changing into a wolf. Then again, Charles had mentioned that people had tried to pose as wolf people in the past, so maybe the king had good reason to doubt my shape-shifting ability. Hell, I'd only just started shape-shifting myself. The king glanced around the dais and then gestured to a small man with a large trumpet. The trumpeter scuttled over, knelt by the throne, and tried to remain still as the king used the trumpeter's head to hoist himself from the throne. Well, it's been a very long time since we had a shapeshifter we didn't know, the king murmured as he leaned in for a closer look. Sire, the doctor said and cleared his throat. And here comes the part one won't like, the king sighed. Well, out with it. Sir Charles, the sample, the doctor said. Charles nodded and opened his fist to reveal the glass vial that held my blood. Sample. The knight held the vial up so that the contents could be seen by the king and anyone else who was on the dais. It took a moment, but the king gasped, and the wolf knights exchanged angry looks. A couple of them started to reach for their weapons, but the king waved them away as he moved toward Charles. What the hell was going on? Is everything okay? I asked after a minute of intense silence. Henry, the king murmured. Why, your blood is as red as an apple. All right, now I was confused. I mean, yeah, your highness, I replied. Isn't all blood red? That was the wrong question. The knights started to murmur in angry voices, and when I glanced at the rest of the banquet hall, I could see people sneering at me while others shook their heads in disbelief. I've had enough of this insolence, someone shouted, and another wolf knight emerged from the banquet hall crowd. The newcomer wore a relatively nondescript bit of chain mail with no coat of arms. His fur was light brown, almost orange like a fox. He was skinnier than the other knights, and I guess that he was either a newbie or just not a very powerful knight. Great, it's Hector, Charles groaned under his breath. Your highness, Hector said as he bowed before the king. Hector, the king replied in a bored tone. What interest do you have in this matter? I merely wish to show Henry of New Jersey the error of his ways, Hector replied. For a commoner to pose as a noble is a grievous sin. As Hector spoke, it was hard not to cringe. He had a nasally voice that made him sound like a teenager going through puberty, and his careful diction made it clear he was the kind of teenager that had only attended the very best private schools. I could feel the anger and hatred radiating from the guy, and we hadn't even spoken to each other yet. Hector produced a small silver dagger from his sleeve, one that couldn't have been more than 6 inches long, and dragged it across his own palm. The king winced at the dramatics, but he didn't offer a reprimand. Instead, the leader of Lupercalia kept his eyes on me as his knight held his palm up so I could see the blood that dripped from the wound. Blue blood? I made a step closer just to make sure, and sure enough my newly heightened senses were hit with a whiff of metallic iron and warmth. It was definitely blood. Yep. This guy's light brown fur was stained with blue blood, which was making its way down his arm in small streams. The entire court had gone completely quiet, and it certainly wasn't an awe-filled silence. In fact, it felt tense and awkward as hell. Oh, I said. I didn't know what the hell to say. I mean, these guys all thought my red blood was weird, but this guy literally looked like he had Gatorade pouring out of his hands. Could this day get any weirder? So, I started. Is that normal? The king snickered slightly as he returned to his throne, and Hector brought his hand down. Of course it's normal, Hector growled. Blue blood is the mark of the shifter, and the mark of Lupercalian nobility. Huh. I let a smirk spread across my lips just because it would piss Hector off. Well, now I understand why everyone is so hot and bothered. We've dealt with posers before. The king shook his head and crossed his arms. And yet we just saw him shift, the king replied. We've never had a red blood manage that before. Perhaps Henry of New Jersey could be an asset, Charles suggested. Perhaps his red blood would allow him entry to places we can't go, or asset. Hector scoffed. What asset could he possibly add to the Knights of Lupercalia? He is just a cheating. Suddenly, a loud growl escaped from my left, and a voice boomed in our direction. Hector! The new voice growled. Hector's eyes widened, and he straightened his back as another wolf stalked toward us. The new wolf looked like an older knight, with gray streaks in his coat and a large scar that ran from his left ear to his neck. He was also covered in glistening jewels. Opals, sapphires, and pearls adorned his. As he marched over, he sounded like a heavy keychain. That's how much precious metal he was packing in that one outfit. Hector, he growled again. Enough of your ridiculous bravado. But, Hector whined. But father. That explained a lot. Hector was an overeager little nepotistic baby who thought he ruled the roost. Luckily his dad seemed pretty damn cool and he wasn't going to let his son's shitty behavior fly. Hector, do you really think to counsel the king in front of your peers of the court? The father wolf growled. Of course not, father. Hector put his head down. As a questing knight, no less? The great wolf shook his head. In your lowly rank you think to show such a great disrespect to your ruler and to your superiors by doubting their advice. Hector was practically shaking but tried to look strong, but this felt like it was only the beginning. Of course not, father, the younger wolf replied. It's just that this red-blooded wolf is an unfamiliar threat, and of course the safety of the kingdom is my only concern, and— Shut up, boy, before you embarrass yourself even more, the great old wolf growled. Get back to your quarters and think about what you've done here today. Of course, father, Hector whispered. The young knight hung his head and began the long walk across the banquet hall, but not before he shot me a nasty glare. But the hall had gone silent again, and everyone watched Hector rather than me. I was definitely not going to complain about that. So what do we do with a red-blooded shapeshifter? The king asked as soon as Hector was out of sight. And just like that, everyone was staring at me again. He is a shapeshifter, sire, Charles replied, even if his blood is red. The king contemplated that for a long minute while the rest of the wolf knights glared daggers at me. Do you think that there is a chance he could be in league with— the king started to ask and then waved his hand in the air. With vampires? Charles finished. Yes, the king replied. Or any of our other enemies. It might explain the red blood. Did you just say vampires? I asked. Like real vampires? I glanced at the tapestry again and realized that all of the creatures it portrayed might be real in this strange world. Hell, werewolves appeared to be running the place, so why wouldn't there be vampires as well? Unfortunately, other than like Dracula, my knowledge of vampires was pretty spotty. I'd never really gotten into the whole vampire thing, though my sister had been a fan when she was younger. I realized I was staring at an especially gruesome depiction of a vampire, which showed a vampire sucking the blood of a young boy. And the blood was blue. I don't know a thing about vampires, I assured them as I forced my eyes away from the tapestry. I mean, other than like in the movies. In what? The doctor demanded. Sort of like stories, I said, but with moving pictures. Look, I can explain it later. But right now I just want to say that I've never met a vampire. I don't want to meet a vampire, and I don't know anything about vampires. If he is in league with any of the beasts of the forests or the vagrants, he will be punished for such an allegiance, the king noted. What punishment? I asked. There is only one punishment for what is essentially treason, the king said. Treason, I muttered. You will be beheaded, Charles said. There were a few gasps from the people behind me, but others clapped and someone shouted, "Do it!" from the other side of the room. I started to imagine my kitchen back in New Jersey, but then I stopped. That would be the easy way out, and for some reason I had a burning desire to prove myself. Besides, I'd only just arrived in this weird alternate world, and I wasn't quite ready to walk away from it. It would certainly be better than spending 2 weeks kicking it with some of my pals and playing video games all day. No, I'd had a taste of wonder and I just wanted more. I wanted to wear the silver armor and wield the silver sword. I wanted to be a knight. Hey, I shouted. I mean, hey, your highness. I trailed off as the king and his knights turned to look at me. Most of the looks made me want to squirm, but I stood up even straighter and addressed the king. Look, I promise I'm not in league with anything like that. I pointed to the tapestry behind them. I'm really new to all of this. I mean, I work in a bookshop. A merchant, the king cut in. But I thought that you were a baker? Oh God, not this again. I'm not a baker, I replied. It's just my name is Baker. I mean, maybe someone in my family used to be a baker, and that's where the name is from. But I am definitely not a baker. The king looked at Charles and then at the doctor. Most unusual, the doctor muttered and shook his head. Most unusual indeed. Look, your highness, I said. I only got here today, but maybe if I showed It'll change your opinion of me. Although I'd been reluctant earlier, it made sense to show them the ring now. After all, it seemed to fit with the whole cosmic motif they had going on, and I knew they would understand the implications. I started to step onto the dais, but two of the wolf knights blocked my way. Didn't fight them, but I did hold up my hand so the king could see the ring. Saw him squint, and then he waved the knights away. You see, someone gave me this ring. I held out my left hand out so that the ring was visible on my pinky finger. Surely not, the king gasped and shook his head. It's made of moon silver, Charles said as he moved to my side. I can tell. Moon silver from just a glance. Where did you find this? Did you steal it? I didn't find it or steal it, I growled. Like I said, it was given to me by this woman. A woman, the king said quietly, like he was afraid of what I would say next. That woman, I said as I pointed at the tapestry. The world seemed to stop for a moment, and it felt like I was the only one who was still alive. But then someone gasped, the king blinked, and everything was normal again. Well, except for all the werewolves that were standing around. What does this mean, Your Highness? Charles asked. The king raised his hand to his chin and furrowed his silver brow as he pondered the mystery before him. It is clear to me, the king announced, that he has been chosen by the moon goddess. But he is not even a follower, the doctor whispered. Is such a thing even possible? By the powers vested in me, I have absolutely no idea, the king said and shrugged. But even I must obey the will of the moon goddess. So we will spare him? Charles asked as if the point needed clarification. Of course we will spare him, the king responded. Not only will we spare him, he will begin training to become a knight. Chapter 5. As you wish, sire, Charles responded with a small bow. I looked down at the doctor, who followed suit and made a small curtsy. I felt a surge of adrenaline rise in my chest. I was going to become a knight. I looked to my right at the knight who had pointed out the tapestry to me. He stood proudly looking ahead over the noble people of the court. That sense of purpose appealed to me. Then I looked to my left at Hector's father. He certainly looked like he had a story or two to tell. I wanted to know how he'd gotten that massive scar that ran down his face to his neck. I wanted to know about the beasts that he must have fought and the battles he must have had in order to have his armor decorated like that. I wanted it all. As I looked over the gathered courtiers, I spotted Hector hidden among the diners at one of the long tables. He had apparently ignored his father's orders to go back to his quarters and had snuck back in so he could wedge himself between two noblewomen. I'd only been here a day, and I already knew he was an untrustworthy little shit. If only the guys I'd gone to high school with could see me now. My high school had been ruled by the kind of guys that thought they were better than everyone else because their parents paid for them to go to fancy colleges. They were the kind of guys who moved to New York after college to become consultants or Wall Street traders and thought that they were living the life. And here I was, spending my vacation from my coffee shop as a werewolf in training to become a knight. How sick was that? Sure, the job of a knight was to protect the kingdom, but I had my secret weapon because if anything got too close to killing me, I could just head back to Jersey as easily as crossing the street. It was a foolproof plan, and I was here for it. The king cleared his throat, and the royal court fell quiet once again. Very well, he said as he rested his chin on his hands. I think I have just the mission for a new questing knight such as yourself. The knights that surrounded the throne threw each other knowing glances as the king trailed off, and I had a sneaking suspicion that I was about to be hazed. Werewolf style. It was hard not to think about the scars on the other werewolves then, and I wondered how many had been won during their first assignment. I looked back up at the king, who was obviously reveling in this dramatic pause. His legs were swinging down back and forth, and it gave the impression of a little kid waiting for dessert. You are to travel to the caves on the outskirts of the forest of Thoth, he started. Been attacking and killing the people who live nearby. You are to slay the Cyclops. You may keep whatever treasure you find, but you must return with proof of your success. What kind of proof? I asked, though I was still churning over the idea that a piece of the creature's treasure will suffice. The king laughed. Everyone knows the only way to claim treasure from a Cyclops is to kill it. Do you accept this quest? Will you vow on the moon goddess that you will not return until you have killed the Cyclops of Thoth or perished? I could remember about the Cyclops legends was that the creatures ate people. I accept the quest, I announced. It's preposterous. A voice shouted from the crowd of nobles at the banquet. Sure enough, Hector was bounding from the dining table back to the king's stage. I shot a look at Hector's father. The older man's eyes were practically red, and a low grumble sounded from his throat. Ah, it's Hector again, the king said in a placid tone and leaned back into his throne. What say you, Hector? Hector, the father growled. Do not defy the king again. Let him speak, the king said in a bored tone, and I had the feeling he was. Hector's chin jutted out as he pulled himself as straight as he could. He shot me an angry glare before he turned to address the king. As he crossed his arms, a quest as important as this one should be given to someone who knows what to do. And then there's the fact that he's a redblood. I'm aware of all of those things, the king said calmly. But if this man is telling the truth, then he was chosen by the moon goddess. Do you challenge the moon goddess? He will receive only the same amenities as the rest of the Lupercalian questing knights. Looked at the floor. Very well, he said in a petty tone of voice. Is it very well? His father growled from my left. Are you satisfied now? But the low. As I said, you must show me a piece of the treasure as proof, but whatever you claim will be yours to keep. I smiled as I looked around at the glittering armor and bejeweled weapons. Realized that the knights had probably claimed at least some of those jewels on similar quests, and I wondered how many I could collect in 2 weeks. Hell, if I could take them back to Earth. Your Highness, Charles said, Henry of New Jersey has no weapons but tooth and claw. He will need some armor and a proper blade. Snapped his fingers at the tiny man with the horn, somewhere behind the tapestry. In the meantime, I would like to join the feast, the king announced as he stood up. The king clapped his hands, and the merrymaking resumed. Courtiers for a moment, and then he walked to the edge of the dais and leaned. I have been giving counsel to witches all evening, the king whispered. Yes, I heard, the old knight whispered back. How do things stand? Not well, the king sighed. They cannot find enough milkweed growing in the local forests, so they will have to travel further afield to find some. The shortage could not come at a worse time, the knight noted. We must stay vigilant until another source is found, the king replied. In the meantime, we will keep up appearances. The king stepped down from the dais and made his way down to one of the larger. So I guess he had his leisure throne and his business throne. Charles looked down at the floor, and I could see the worry that creased his brow. I remembered what the other knight had said about Lupercalia as well, and I glanced at the tapestry again. Charles had said that the kingdom was more like the left side of the tapestry, where creatures and evil forces ran rampant. He'd also hinted that the knights were short-handed, and I wondered if the moon goddess had started recruiting others to her cause because there weren't enough werewolves in this world. Could I expect other people from Earth to appear? My train of thought was interrupted when the little man with the trumpet suddenly reappeared from behind the tapestry. As he scuttled closer to us, I could see he carried a chest plate that looked like it was made out of tin and a medieval-looking axe. The weapon had an ordinary wooden handle and an undecorated blade with a curve on the bottom that sloped down like a teardrop. At least the edge was sharp, though I was disappointed to see that the axe shaft was only about 2 feet long. I started. Thanks, guys. The weaponry for a knight's first quest is always plain, and is easily disposable, Charles said. So it will not be a great loss if, well, I'm sure you understand. And I can attack them with my claws? I asked. And my teeth? So I can learn how to fight like a wolf. Of course, he replied. If the simple blade won't get the job done, the moon goddess has blessed us with claws that can cut through metal and jaws that can crush bone. Incredible, I said. Well, yes, he scratched behind his ear. The first quest given to a young knight is supposed to be difficult, and if a new knight were to rely only on his weaponry, then what kind of test would that be? That's crazy, I said. So not all of the knights come back? The knights who are worth a damn will rise to the occasion and triumph, while some others will fail and rot in whatever cave they fight their first and last battle in. Do any knights refuse? I asked gingerly. The knights that renounce their vows in the face of danger are denounced to live a life of shame. He growled. I thought back to the burning building and the calm energy of the moon goddess. She had chosen me specifically, so there was no way I was going to let this flimsy axe and tin can armor stop me in my quest to show everyone that I deserved to be a knight. I felt a fire in my wolf belly. I wanted to get on this quest as soon as possible. When do I leave? I asked Charles. It would be best to wait for first light, the older knight suggested. Since you're not familiar with Lupercalia, you will need time to prepare. Of course, I agreed. But with a wolf's senses, you can see very well in the dark, the physician said. But the terrain is unfamiliar. I doubt you would let Charles wander around New Jersey in the middle of the night if he'd only just arrived. I tried not to laugh at the image of the large knight wandering around New Jersey on a quest. What would a quest in New Jersey even look like? A trip to White Castle and then hunting the Jersey Devil in the Pine Barrens. Hank, Charles whispered. Yeah, sorry, I said. I was just thinking about New Jersey. Homesick already? The knight asked with a grin. No, I assured him quickly. I was just trying to imagine what kind of quests a knight could perform in New Jersey. Charles gave me a puzzled look, and I reminded myself that these guys had never lived in a world without knights or quests. Sebastian will see you to the quarters for questing knights, Charles added a moment later. Sebastian. I furrowed my brow. I'd met a lot of people so far, but I couldn't remember anyone named Sebastian. Yes, a small voice piped up. I looked down at my feet, and the tiny man with the trumpet who had been standing next to the king was waving up at me and smiling. Oh hey, I said. I'm Hank. Hello, the little guy said. I thought that the only polite thing to do would be to get down on his level a little bit by shrinking back down to my human size. I closed my eyes and imagined my limbs returning to their former size, and the hair getting absorbed back into my body. I even did a little shake like I'd seen Charles do, to get the whole thing going. When I opened my eyes, I was shorter, and my body felt weaker than before, like I'd come off of a kind of adrenaline high. Most intriguing, sir, Sebastian declared. Come with me now, sir. I will show you to your quarters for the night. He walked off, and I looked back at Charles. The older knight offered me a smile and started to wave me after my guide, but then he took a step closer. If I don't see you before your quest, I'm sure it'll be a great triumph, he said. But then he winked at me and started to pull me in Sebastian's wake toward the tapestry. The knights still on duty watched warily, but Charles ignored their stares. The older knight pulled back the edge of the tapestry to reveal a small gap in a door. He turned the brass doorknob and then pushed the door open. Watch your step, Charles said as Sebastian started down another winding stone staircase. I descended the staircase carefully since the steps were quite small and looked like they had been there for centuries. Is this the only way to the quarters? I asked. I didn't want to challenge his authority, but I was wary of the fact that it seemed kind of inconvenient to go down this precarious spiral staircase. Well, no, he sighed. But from the banquet hall it is the quickest, and this is the staircase that most knights will use when they are to receive their honors and titles. You wouldn't want to have to walk through an entire banquet hall to receive an honor from the king, would you? I guess not, I said. So it's like a kind of stage door? What? I heard him say from behind me. Never mind, I trailed off. The spiral staircase finally came to an end, and I stood at the bottom of the stairs at another wooden door and waited for Sebastian to show me the way. I'll let Sebastian guide you from here, Charles said. I have to play my part at the feast as a knight of the realm. The older knight started back up the steps, and I listened to the sound of his retreat for a moment until Sebastian cleared his throat. I looked to my right and saw there was a big 2-foot wooden torch on the wall. I plucked it from where it was hanging and held it in front of my face. Sebastian turned another big brass doorknob and pushed the door open. I held. This hallway felt different. Firelight, but it felt like we were in a nicer part of the palace. I couldn't figure out why I was so sure of that, until I realized that I wasn't walking on cold stone anymore. I looked down and saw that the floors. This is the Hall of Great Portraiture, Sebastian squeaked. But we only keep it lit during ceremonies. We don't want to damage the artwork. Highly decorated Wolf Knight. Wolf held a sword with the different cycles of the moon engraved all the way. Each moon had either a precious stone or a pearl set into it. Ah yes, Sebastian started. That's grayback. All knights get buried with. We believe wholeheartedly that they must be on his armor or his weaponry to his son. That makes sense, I said. I suppose you need knights that are actually qualified enough to protect the kingdom rather than knights who just want all the fancy perks. Exactly, Sebastian conceded as we walked on. Portraiture next to the questing knight's quarters as a type of inspiration, you could say. I certainly thought that all the loot these knights had on display was inspiring. Obviously, they earned their way to it, but I'd fight any beast that came my way if I knew that the payoff was the sickest weaponry in the entire kingdom and made just for me as well. At the end of the hallway was another large wooden door with a brass doorknob. Sebastian turned the doorknob and pushed the door to reveal a brightly lit hallway. You can leave that there, my short guide said as he motioned toward a line of empty torch holders. I popped the torch in one of the rings and then followed Sebastian around the corner into another stone hallway. This one had long arched windows on the left side and was lit with several torches. Several little hallways sprouted off on the right-hand side, and Sebastian led me to one of the shorter hallways about 20 yards further along. All right, he said and pointed to the door. Welcome to the questing knights' quarters. This is where you will sleep in anticipation of your first mission. Thanks, I said. Well, good night, I guess. Good night, he chirped and scuttled away through the hallway. I was alone in the palace. That was not something I'd ever expected to say in my lifetime. The door to my room looked like it was made of old oak, and it had a winding wooden pattern engraved in the center. There was also a torch directly outside for emergencies, I suppose. I pushed the door open, and was pleasantly surprised by what I found. The whole place must have been 200 square feet, which was way bigger than the room I had back in Jersey. On the opposite side of the room was a window with an arch at the top. On the left was a king-sized bed, or night-sized I should say, with burgundy bedding. On the right-hand side there was a big wooden chest. Someone had left a lit candle on a small wooden bedside table that sat to the right of the bed. I kicked off my sneakers and flung them near the chest. After looking around the room, I plopped down my axe and my armor on the chest so that I could find it easily in the morning. It had been a long-ass day, and I was going to fight a cyclops tomorrow to boot. It was definitely time for some shut-eye. But I caught a glimpse of myself in the darkened window before I could crawl beneath the covers. I looked the same as always, with short brown hair the same color as my fur, a strong jaw, and bright blue eyes. How was that even possible? I sighed and started to pull the covers back, and I noticed that someone had laid out a cotton burgundy tunic that matched the bedding. I'd never been one to wear a nightdress for obvious reasons, but I definitely didn't want to wear my jeans or my sweaty t-shirt to bed if I didn't have to. So I pulled off my Hulk t-shirt and flung it onto the wooden chest. Then I kicked off my jeans and pulled the burgundy tunic over my head. The cotton against my skin felt so fresh, comforting, and clean that I actually sighed. Even though I was wearing what amounted to a dress, I could definitely get used to this kind of thing. Finally, I hopped into the bed and pulled the covers over me. The fabric was slightly coarser than what I was used to back home, but it was still comfy and clean. I looked around the room one more time just in case this all turned out to be a dream in the morning. I took in the stone walls, the wooden chest, and the axe I'd used to slay the cyclops, and then I blew out the candle. Tiny trail of smoke drifted in the moonlight, and then I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. My eyes flew open what felt like only a few minutes later, and it took me a moment to understand why I'd woken up. Someone was pounding on my door, and I sat up quickly as I wondered if my sister had come to check on me. But then I saw the stone ceiling, the burgundy bedding, and the half-melted candle on the table and realized I was still in Lupercalia. I glanced out the window, and though I didn't know what time it was, the morning light looked delicate, like it was early out. "Oh, brother," I groaned as someone pounded on the door again. I lumbered out of bed and looked down. Yup, I was still wearing a nightdress. Or maybe I should call it a night dress. I made my way over to the door of my room and pulled it open. "Good morning, eternal protector." A girl that looked about my age made a very low curtsy in front of me. She had dark brown hair that was parted sharply in the middle and pulled back into a low bun. She was wearing a simple black dress to her ankles and a white apron to cover it. When she rose, I saw that she had pale, freckled skin and deep hazel eyes. Her lips were curved like rose petals, and she reminded me a bit of the actress Zooey Deschanel. Her eyes flickered upwards and met mine. Her soft, pale hand flew up to her mouth as she tried to stifle a giggle. but I could tell it was out of shyness. "Are you the new questing knight?" she asked in a low voice. "I guess I am," I replied. "What's your name?" "Gosh, none of the knights ever ask about me." Her cheeks blushed a deep pink. "I'm Perdita." "Well, good morning, Perdita," I said. "What brings you here at such an hour?" "Well, it's time for your departure, of course." The skin around her eyes creased in an affectionate way as a smile spread across her face. "I have your new garb in the sack. Best of luck on your mission. Oh, and I've been instructed to tell you to go to the banquet hall before your journey to eat breakfast." "Thanks," I said with a smile. This was a pretty great wake-up call after all. Perdita curtsied again, handed me the sack, and then turned away to leave. But then she stopped and turned back around to face me. "Oh," she said. "Yes," I asked. "I just wanted to say you're very nice." She giggled as her cheeks bloomed a deep pink again. "Thanks," I laughed. "So are you." "I really hope you don't die," she added. "So do I," I replied. "I'd like to see you again." "Me too." I smiled. See you again. That is. It is settled then. You will valiantly slay the Cyclops and then return. We'll look forward to it." She laughed and then lifted her skirt and skipped away down the hallway. I closed the door and then turned my attention to the sack Perdita had handed me. I pulled out a blue tunic, suede pants, bright red woolen socks, leather boots, and a chainmail vest with a hood. "Cool," I declared as I tossed my nightgown on the bed. The clothes were surprisingly comfortable and fit well, and the boots were definitely better for walking around a forest. Even the chainmail wasn't terrible, though I did sigh when I picked up the armor plate. The plate was definitely a one-size-fits-all kind of job, and despite the straps, it was hard to get it exactly right. I finally gave up when I found a decent balance between pinched skin and sliding armor, tucked the axe into the sack, and then set off for the banquet hall as instructed. Since the only route I knew was the one I'd taken the night before, I passed through the hall of portraiture again. The images passed by in a blur, and I realized I was running. I forced myself to slow down since I didn't want to waste my energy running around the palace, but it was impossible not to take the steps two at a time. At the top of the stairs, I opened the door and peered at the banquet hall. From behind the tapestry for a moment, there were a few people milling around, but it was nearly empty compared to the night before. The place looked vast in the early morning sunlight, and the silver thread in the table runners gave the place an ethereal glow. I snuck out from behind the tapestry, walked quickly across the dais, and dropped to the stone floor. I made my way over to the nearest table that had been prepped for breakfast and stopped in my tracks when I saw another suckling pig was on the menu. When in Rome. I sighed and shook my head. Plates, cups, and cutlery had been set out at each spot, so I grabbed a set, filled my plate with a slice from the belly, and then filled my cup with the liquid in the jugs. I nearly dropped my plate when the liquid turned out to be a dark brown color, and a quick sniff confirmed that it was coffee. "Oh, that smells good," I said as I took another whiff. I found a spot near the back door and sat down with my breakfast. The pork belly was still hot enough that a small trail of steam wafted up from it when I sliced into it, and I caught the scent of something that reminded me of cumin. The first bite was divine, and I closed my eyes for a moment while I savored the meat. I was nearly done with the pork belly before I remembered that I had coffee as well. I reached for the cup, took another sniff, and then took a tentative sip. "Holy crap," I muttered and took a long swig. It was euphoric. This coffee was unlike anything I'd ever tasted in my life, and I'd drunk probably 3 million cups of coffee in my life. Hell, I usually spent my morning curating and weighing beans just like I had for the last 7 years. And this was something else. This was insanely good. I could sense a feeling of happiness and energy rush up my spine and down my arms. I turned around to look at the other nobles, who were also quietly drinking coffee, but they didn't seem to be having anywhere near the same reaction as I was. Was it just me? Impossible. This Lupercalian coffee felt like pure bliss. Every sip made me happy, and I could feel my thoughts sharpen as well. It was like I was suddenly at my physical and mental peak, and I hadn't even changed into my wolf form yet. I wondered if the coffee was only for the nobility, or if the ordinary people had access to it too. I was obviously already a coffee guy, but this was undoubtedly the best drink that had ever crossed my lips. If only my sister and I had this stuff on Earth, we'd make a killing. I'd seen Chains sell a cup of joe for $7 a pop, and that was just fancy Colombian crap that tasted like soil. This though? If we could get this in the shop, we'd be minted. I sucked down the rest of the coffee in blissful peace, polished off the pork belly, and then looked around again. I was ready to start the day, even though I had no idea where I was going or how long it would take. The one thing I could be sure of was that I wouldn't encounter a McDonald's along the way. Also didn't have any of the local currency, so packing a few supplies seemed like a good idea. I piled some of the pork onto a napkin and added that to my sack. When I stood up to leave, I noticed that several people were watching me. One of those was another questing knight who wore the same tin can armor and carried the same short axe. The questing knight shot me an evil eye before he leaned over to his companion to whisper something. Apparently, Hector's disdain for me was shared by some other members of the court. Yeah, I was going on my first quest, and yeah, I was red-blooded, unlike the rest of the nobility. But I had something that none of them did, but all of them wanted. I'd been chosen by the moon goddess, and I'd be protected by her too if all else failed. I'd be able to pop back to New Jersey and spend the rest of my vacation sunbathing in my little backyard if things with the Cyclops got a little too hairy. Not that I wanted to, but it was always good to have choices. It was time to prove my worth. It was time to get going. It was time to be a werewolf knight. Chapter 6. As I looked around the dining hall, I realized that I didn't actually know where the official exit was or how to get out of the palace from here. I'd taken so many secret staircases and shortcuts on my first night that the only way I knew that led to the main gate was the one that would take me back to the physician's lair. It was that moment that reality hit hard. This wasn't just some dimly lit fever dream full of weird mutants and people who wanted to publicly embarrass me, even though that's exactly what last night felt like. I really was in Lupercalia, and if I ever got out of the palace, I'd be merrily on my way to literally slay a Cyclops in a very short amount of time. Come on, I muttered to myself. There had to be someone here who knew their way around. Well, I assumed everyone did, but specifically someone who would be happy to help me. But none of the other diners would meet my eye, and those that glanced in my direction either scowled or frowned. I was about to give up and head back the only way I knew when I spotted a small figure in front of one of the large windows. It was Sebastian, and he was watching something that no one else seemed interested in. I picked up my sack and made my way past the long wooden tables to where Sebastian was leaning on his trumpet, with the wide end resting on the floor. I felt a bouncy energy from the coffee beans that made me want to skip around and run toward the small man, and I realized that maybe I hadn't impressed Perdita when she came to my quarters at all. Maybe she was just totally jacked up on coffee beans for her morning shift. Sebastian. I grinned down at the noble little footman. He immediately shook his head and broke out of whatever trance he'd been in as he stared out the window. And noble protector. He straightened his back and held his trumpet to his side. Hall. Unlike last night, there wasn't enough of a crowd in the dining hall to. Few angry glares were cast in our direction, but at least he didn't run away. It's time for me to start my quest, I explained. So how do I get out of this place? Sebastian stared up at me with raised eyebrows, and I doubted a lot of people referred to the royal palace as this place. Seemed to just be in the middle of the large wooden wall that was to the left of the windows. I was puzzled. It was like they just put this giant metal doorknob in the middle of the wall for no reason. His strength. An exasperated little noise escaped from his mouth, and I had to stifle a laugh. Suddenly, the wall opened to reveal another hallway. The door was 10 feet tall and blended perfectly into the wall. Seemed like secrets were practically built into this place. Well, he brushed himself off. It's the entrance closest to where you'll be. Remember the ones to the right. The left staircase will take you to but the right staircase will take you to the courtyard. Jousting fields? Guess I had a lot to learn about what these guys did for fun. But for now it was time to set out for the forest where the Cyclops lived. Thank you, Sebastian. I smiled and then made a salute to my forehead. Evidently the salute was not a thing for these guys. He placed his trumpet back on the floor and brought his right hand to his forehead, kind of like he was blocking the sun. Yes, he squeaked triumphantly. Close enough. I marched through the massive door and into a stone hallway with an unlit torch to my right. To my left there was a stained glass window shaped like a flower. The center of the window was a deep royal blue, and it was surrounded by bright red petals and pairs of green leaves. When I glanced at the floor, shape of the flower. These guys really knew how to decorate. But my quest was calling to me, so I walked to the end of the hall when I opened the door I found a landing for a pair of staircases, one that curved away to the right and one that curved away to the left. Least not yet. I trotted down the stairs to the right, under the blue and red light from another stained glass window. And lots more of that sick coffee. The steps seemed endless, and when I peeked over the side it looked like I still had 100 to go. No wonder these people could eat so decadently if they were making journeys like this multiple times a day. Suckling pig for breakfast? Sure. The bottom of the staircase finally appeared, and I pressed my hand on the clunk on the stone floor that echoed up the stairwell. To my left, the sun was streaming through a stone arch, the only way out of the stairwell. The early morning heat felt good against my skin, and once my eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, I saw the familiar olive tree in the center of the courtyard. And just beyond the tree were the guards that manned the drawbridge. Other than the guards, the courtyard was empty, which I found surprising. I'd assumed that there would be other knights getting ready to set out on their my mother's obsession with the British royal family. I'd managed to avoid learning anything about royalty, nobility, and what the heck they did all day. I approached the guards, who were in hybrid wolf form. As I stepped between them, neither of them even looked at me. They just stared straight ahead at the kingdom of Lupercalia. And what a kingdom it was. If they didn't want to talk to me, so be it. Stepped onto the drawbridge and took in the beautiful scenery. Lush, green fields with forests and a mountainous region in the far distance. The small town had smoke rising out of the chimneys, and the sky was as clear as ever, like no pollution had even touched it. I knew that if I stuck to the road, I'd return to Stock, the little village where Charles had found me. But the road was empty, and the forest seemed to loom over the countryside. I felt some of the sprightliness from the coffee disappear as my heart sank, and I realized I was setting off to fight a beast, and I had no idea where the hell I was going. Okay, what had the king said again? You are to travel to the caves on the outskirts of the forest of Thoth. Thoth. That was a mouthful. I peered to my left and my right. Well, there was a forest on either side of the road. Or maybe just one really big one divided by the road. But which one was Thoth? I looked behind me at the guards, who grasped long silver spears that glittered in the sun. They ignored me and what I was sure was the panicked look on my face as dust gathered on their eyeballs. Hey guys, I tried. Not even a blink of an eye. Can you point me toward Thoth? I asked. The guards remained perfectly still, and I fought the urge to punch one in the face. What the hell was I gonna do? I decided to jack up my confidence by changing into my hybrid form, so I closed my eyes and shook my head, just like how I'd seen Charles do when he transformed. I felt energy coursing through me, almost like I was being electrocuted, but it was warm and inviting, like slipping into a warm bath. When I opened my eyes, I felt more alive than I ever had before. In fact, I felt downright invincible. The looming forest looked much less threatening, and the two guards were merely ordinary. But I still didn't know where the hell I was going. I took a few steps across the drawbridge while I debated where to go. Stopped in the middle for a moment and glanced at the poisonous moat. The witches might have been having problems finding the right ingredients, but the black and bubbling ooze still looked dangerous to me. I even saw a rat skeleton drift under the bridge, which sent a shiver up my spine. Okay, I sighed. No more delays. I'll go to Stock, ask where the forest is, and then go from there. Hank! Someone called out behind me. I turned around and saw Charles running toward me in his hybrid form. He ran powerfully and elegantly with large strides, but the clinking of his chain mail made him sound like a coin purse. Hank, wait! Charles called out. Don't worry, I'm waiting. I laughed. I realized that my hybrid laugh sounded like a low growl, which I kind of liked. It was like I had the badass chain smoker movie star voice I'd always wanted, but without completely filling my lungs with tar. Charles slowed down as he passed the guards and regarded them with a regal nod. They made the same curt gesture to him and then turned their attention back to the road. Well, at least I knew now that they didn't ignore everyone. Hank, Charlie said in a low voice as he approached me. I thought it was only right to see you before you set off on your quest. I thought back to the wink he'd given me last night and I got the sense that this wasn't exactly protocol. I also got the feeling that he was about to do me a solid that some of the other nobles wouldn't approve of. Well, thanks, I said. I'll walk with you to the road, he said as he started to walk onward. We walked across the drawbridge together, and when we reached the far end he stopped with his back to the guards and as close to me as he could get without actually hugging me. The palace guards are discreet, but I'd rather they weren't involved, he whispered. Take this. He somehow moved in even closer to my side, pulled a scroll from his pocket, and then passed it to me. It looked like parchment paper, but I couldn't see the contents because it had been tied shut with a piece of red twine. This map will help guide you on your way, Charles whispered. It's quite accurate. How much does it cover? I asked as I tucked it into my bag. All of Lupercalia, he replied with a smile. I'm sure you'll need it for your other quests. I know many are still skeptical about you and your quest, he whispered. But I believe your story and I believe the goddess sent you. I may not know why, at least not yet, but that does not matter. It is enough that she sent you. Well, thanks again, I said. I wish I knew why she sent me here, but maybe we can figure that out when I get back. I'd enjoy that, he said with a laugh. It would certainly be more interesting than most of the conversations around here. What do people even talk about around here? I asked. Charles glanced back at the guards and then shrugged. Mostly how to get more, he sighed. More gems, more silver, more power. No one spends much time talking about why we're here anymore. Yeah, I replied. There aren't any nobles where I'm from, but there are plenty of people who want more. I thought about the McHughes and their bid to be somebody. They were certainly power-hungry, and they were willing to make shitty overpriced houses at the expense of their tenants just so they could play the American version of Lord of the Manor. That's why I don't like to stay at court, Charles said. I prefer it out in the village, protecting my people. When you're in simple cottages on the farms and in the fields, you remember how the moon goddess loves her people, and how they love her back. From the way they tend to their pigs to the songs they sing to their children before bed, their life is devoted to her, and it's a beautiful thing to witness. It sounds like it, I agreed. And it seemed pleasant aside from the welcome wagon. Charles laughed and shook his head, and we both glanced in the direction of. There was a wistful look in the older man's eyes, and I had no doubt I was raised into this life, Charles said. Nights like the ones you met yesterday? I asked. Those movies set in the Middle Ages, but I'd never paid much attention to what. But I have no doubt that you'll learn it quickly. I laughed. Of course, he started. We don't need to get into the particulars, but remember this. Fight hard but fight fair. Your kingdom. Those are some pretty damn good rules no matter where you are, I said with a laugh. The forest of Thoth is that way, he said as he pointed toward the edge of the woods on the left. Depths of the forest and using the map from there. Then that's what I'll do, I agreed. Charles turned around and started back across the drawbridge. I watched him past the guards, who gave him a curt nod, and then turned to look at the trees. Again, at least it was shaded, and it seemed like a good idea to reach the forest before the sun rose any higher, so I started to run toward the trees in my hybrid form. I'd never been one to jog, but this felt invigorating in a way I'd never felt before. It was like I could smell every blade of grass, the village to my right and the forest straight ahead of me. But I felt kind of like a fool running with my tinkin armor. My too tight chest plate and my chain mail knocked against each other uncomfortably, and my sack banged against my back. Okay, time to go full wolf style. It was a weird maneuver, but I looked down on the ground and almost fell onto my arms. And then the change came over me. It was like this was how I was supposed to be. My paws patted against the ground and my speed increased by what felt like tenfold. I'd never felt so free in my life. It was like I was completely guided by my senses, from my sense of smell to my supervision. Even at my speed I could see a gray rabbit 100 yards away from me diving into its hole. As I was hurtling toward the forest faster than I'd ever moved in my life, I did something I'd never done before. I stuck my tongue out of my mouth and let it hang out like the dog I was, because boy, being covered in fur and running at such a speed in the middle of summer was hot work. I could see my destination a few hundred yards away now, and the shadows beneath the trees beckoned to me. For a moment I thought about the coffee and I wondered how much faster I would be if I'd had another cup before I set off, as I felt invincible, despite all the dire warnings from Charles. If we had the beans in the cafe, the coffee would sell like hotcakes. We made more money on coffee than books anyway, but we'd be McHugh's rich if I could figure out a way to get some of the beans back to the shop. I suddenly realized that I'd been racing forward without even thinking about it, and I was practically to the forest. It was like my body was a running machine while my mind could focus on things like coffee and books. It was freaking amazing. I slowed down to a canter and then to a trot as I tested the air. I knew where every small creature was within several miles of me just from that one sniff, and I had to fight the urge to chase a nearby squirrel. No wonder dogs always get so distracted, I muttered. Tree roots stuck up from the ground, and pebbles hid beneath a layer of dead leaves. Holes threatened to trip up unwary walkers, and a cloud of gnats hovered nearby. But none of these things bothered me as I stepped into the woods. In my wolf form, I could sense all of those dangers and avoid them with ease. As I'd hoped, it was cooler beneath the trees, and my panting subsided. Licked my chops, pulled my tongue back in, and then peered around at the nearby trees. There was no obvious human trail, though I could see several paths that the local wildlife used. It was tempting to turn back into a human and check the map, but Charles had said to wait until I was in the heart of the forest. I found it hard to believe that anyone else from the palace would just be strolling through this area, but I'd honor the older knight's instructions anyway. I pawed at the ground and then started a bouncy canter. I didn't want to tear through the forest because there was always the chance that I could hit a tree or something. Hell, it was still my first full day at being a dog. It had never been so easy to move through such heavily wooded areas before. And once again, I let my mind wander back to the coffee beans while my body cut a quick path through the trees. I got a whiff of something to my right and slowed my pace. It was like a stream of scent, something super fresh that piqued my interest. The wolf side of me quickly identified the smell as water, and suddenly I was thirsty. I followed the scent, and as I got closer, the smell got clearer and bigger. A moment later, I heard the burbling of a stream. I hopped over a thick winding, and the water smelled like untouched rainwater. I covered the last few feet with a single hop, and then I brought my face down to the water to drink. But I froze when I saw the image that looked back at me, and if I'd been in human form, I probably would have rubbed my hand along my chin just to be sure I was looking at myself. The reflection revealed a great wolf with huge, terrifying teeth and a strong jaw. I had dark brown fur that was the exact shade of my normal hair, and eyes that were the same striking deep blue. If I'd met my wolf self in the dark forest, I'd probably be scared as hell. I turned my head to the side and let my tongue flap out. Not only was I ferocious beast, but I was also kinda cute. Then, with an animalistic abandon, I shoved my whole face in the brook. It had been a long run and I wanted to cool off. After submerging my snout for a few seconds, I whipped it out and shook my head. Water flew everywhere as my ears flopped against my head, and I felt like a child again as I sprayed the surrounding area until it was drenched. Once that was out of my system, I bent down again and drank deeply from the stream. My tongue carried the water back into my mouth instinctively. It felt weird at first, but once I decided to just go with it, it became easier. I drank until I was full, and after another good shake, I was ready to set off. Again, I sniffed the air, which seemed to be another instinctual behavior, and thought I detected a human scent nearby. Before I could untangle the array of scents, I heard a woman shriek in fear and anger. Charles's words came back to me, and I knew there was only one thing I could do. I set off in the direction of the woman's voice at a fast lope as I tried to figure out how many people were involved in whatever was happening. "Don't you dare touch me," the woman shouted. "Stay back." My nose could isolate the woman's scent easily enough, but the men were more muddled. I was sure there was more than one man, but they smelled so similar. I couldn't be sure how many. I had my answer when I reached a clearing and saw the backs of 3 men. I inched around for a better look and saw that the one on the left had a long 4-foot whip in his hand while the guy on the right was holding a dagger. I couldn't tell if the guy in the middle had any weapons, but it seemed safe to assume that he did. "I'll curse you," the woman shouted. "I'll curse you and all your children, too. Your descendants will still be cursed long after you've been dead and buried." There was something familiar about the woman, and then I realized I'd seen her in stock. She had been the one bright pop of color in the place, and even now, I found myself staring at her shocking green eyes. Just give us the basket, the man in the middle said, and then you can go home to your hovel. I don't have anything valuable in here, she replied as she pulled the basket against her chest. It's just some wild herbs for treating coughs. Bullshit, the man on the left snapped. We know you're picking lamb's ear sage, the man on the right piped in. And that's going for a pretty penny these days. So hand it over, the man in the middle insisted. You would endanger the whole kingdom for a few scraps of gold? She demanded. We would, the man in the middle agreed. And we'll kill for it too. Now, you can leave here alive or your body can molder here with the leaves, but we want that basket. I was sure my wolf form would probably be enough to scare them away, but after listening to their threats, I wanted to do more than just chase them out of the forest. So I pictured my hybrid self, and a moment later my skin started to tug and pull as my body shifted. When I opened my eyes, I towered above the men as well as almost everything else except the trees. It would be easy enough to rip them apart with my teeth, but once again I remembered Charles's words. I didn't want to be one of those asses who got killed on his first quest because he was cocky, so I opened my sack and pulled out my axe. Then, for dramatic effect, I leapt out from behind my tree and landed with a thud right behind them. Let her go, I growled and gnashed my teeth. The woman, who was facing me, was obviously shocked that a knight had come to her aid in the middle of nowhere. Her eyes widened in fear, and she nearly fell onto her back as she started to scramble away from me. The brigands whipped around at my growl and froze. The guy on my right let out a pathetic gasp, but the guy in the center just smirked. He was holding a rope in his hands, and he twisted the shank as he eyed me. A knight, he cackled. You're a bit far from the palace, aren't you? Let the woman go, I said. She said she has nothing for you. He looked down at the rope and then back at me. Well, that isn't much of a problem, you see, doggy boy, he started, because if she hasn't got anything for me, she's pretty enough herself that I could just take her home and, well, do whatever I wanted with her. The other two schmucks made jeering noises, and then the man on the right slapped him on the back. The man with the rope smiled and tilted his head down like he was giving me some kind of Kubrick stare. But the important thing was that the men were focused on me. I was the only one looking at the beautiful girl at the moment, and as she rose to her feet, I tried to signal her to run away. She frowned at first when she caught my eye, but then she seemed to understand. When I growled at the men again, she suddenly lifted her skirts and bolted in the opposite direction. She made it about 10 yards away before the three men realized that she'd moved, and the man with the rope grunted in frustration. He started after the girl, as if he was convinced that his two friends could deal with me, but before the buffoons could do more than stare at their friend's back, I launched myself through the air. It was amazing how much ground I could cover just by leaping, and as I sailed toward the man, I had time to bring the axe over my head. When I landed just behind the man, I grabbed the back of his shirt with my claws. Wait, he choked out as he tried to pull away. But his fate had been sealed the moment he'd attacked the woman, and I brought the axe down on his head and watched as it split open like a melon. He fell to the ground, first on his knees and then his head hit the ground. I growled at his body as blood gushed from his head onto the mossy woodland ground. The blood was bright red like mine, but this guy didn't have any special powers, and he never would. I turned to the other two as the scent of blood filled my nostrils. It was all I could smell now, and it made me want to kill again. Any takers? I growled. The one with the dagger bolted in the opposite direction, even deeper into the woods. He would be easy enough to track if something else didn't kill him first. That just left the man with the whip, and when I turned to grin at him, he looked pissed. I'm sick of you dogs running the show, he hissed. You think I don't know what your stupid little outfit means? You're a quester, and questers are just stupid little rich boys running around thinking they can kill monsters just because they can turn into a walking dog. Well, what's another lost knight on his first mission? They'll assume you're lost in some cave. This guy had some gall. I mean, talking to a 9-foot wolf who had just taken out his pal with an axe? Hell, I hadn't even used my sharp, purpose-built teeth made for ripping flesh apart. He pulled the whip behind his head as his face twisted into a scowl. He brought the whip over his head, but I waited for the strip of leather to start to drop before I lunged toward him. My whole body felt on fire, and I could have sworn that I could already taste his blood. I opened my mouth wide as I focused on his neck, and before the Whip could even crack over my head. I sank my teeth into his neck like it was butter. The force of the impact flattened him into the dirt, though I didn't feel a thing. My jaws were firmly locked around his throat, and blood filled my mouth. But I didn't let go until I heard him stop gurgling. I finally detached my mouth from his neck and sat up to check that he was down. His lifeless eyes stared at the branches overhead, and his face was forever frozen in a look of fear. I can't believe you actually thought you would win, I snorted as I stood up. And I'm not some rich boy pretending to be a warrior. I looked around the clearing then, but there was neither sign nor scent of the woman. I hope she made it all the way back to stock, and I made a mental note to stop there on my way back and make sure she was okay. But first, I probably needed to wash the blood off my axe and myself. Flies were already starting to circle my head, and I could hear their annoying buzzing near my ears. Even in my hybrid form, there was little I could do besides sweat at the insects, and I sighed in frustration. I collected my sack and started to backtrack to the brook when I heard a rustling in the bushes. I turned to look and growled in warning. I was pretty sure I'd killed or chased off all of the attackers, though my nostrils were so full of the scent of blood that I was worried that I might have missed one. But a familiar dark green dress appeared from behind one of the trees instead. Hey, the woman called over in a low, dulcet voice. Thanks for that. I thought you ran into the woods, I replied. I couldn't resist watching that fight, she admitted. It's not something I get to see every day. And to see a knight take out 3 oafs on 2 separate occasions is well unheard of. So you remember me? I smiled before I remembered that my lips and teeth were still covered in blood. I guess you could say that, she laughed. What's your name? I'm Hank, I called over. You don't sound like you're from here. She squinted her bright green eyes, like she was scrutinizing me. I'm not, I responded. She stared at me intently. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm